Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Time First series hosted by CVA Las Mercedes. I'm Marcia Anglerell, and I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer of the Venezuela Affairs Unit. And today I'll be moderating the fourth edition of this program in which we discuss important American female leaders. And today we'll be featuring Ellen Degeneres, an outstanding American comedian. And of course, we'll also be hosting one of the co-directors of this documentary, Spencer Bakalar of Time Magazine. As usual, we'll ask her some questions. We'll invite you to do the same. So please put your questions in the chat box. We invite you also to share comments as well as questions. But please keep in mind that Spencer is not an expert on Ellen DeGeneres, but she is obviously a celebrity and a member of the LGBT community, Ellen DeGeneres is, and we can discuss matters related to those traits of her personality. Remember also that you can pose your questions in either English or Spanish, and we'll translate those into Spanish for Diane. So first, let's say hello to Spencer. Hi, Spencer. Welcome back.
Hi, Marcia. Thank you so much for having me again, and thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. This project took over about 2.5 years of my life, so I'm so glad that it's still being watched and enjoyed, and I hope you all get a chance to look at more of the videos in the project as well.
Well, really glad to have you here, and yeah, look forward to talking with you about this particular interview. First, let me just provide a little bit information about Ellen DeGeneres before we get to the film. So she is an American comedian, television host, actress, writer, and producer. She was also the first person who starred as an openly gay character on a primetime American TV show with her sitcom Ellen in 1997. Since then, she's been hosting her syndicated TV show, The Ellen DeGeneres Show, that started in 2003. Okay, so let's go now to the short film on Ellen DeGeneres. All right, welcome back. So Spencer, again, we understand you're not an expert on Ellen DeGeneres, but you obviously had the chance to interview her along with other female celebrities. So of all the women you were privileged to have interviewed for this documentary film series, is there anything particular that stood out for you in interviewing Ellen DeGeneres?
Yes, I would say over the course of the project, I was very surprised. So before I came to Time Magazine, I worked at the Los Angeles Times, which even though we're in, Los Angeles is the hub of celebrity culture out here, that newspaper is very community centered. So Time was really my first introduction to celebrity interviews. And for the course of the project, I think both myself and Diane, my co-director, were surprised at how honest and open that they were with us. Ellen herself was really serious over the course of her interview, very different from the personality that you see on her talk show. And that's something that I was really pleased about with all of the first women, especially the celebrities, that they were just super honest with us. And I think a few things contributed to that. First, we were a really small, all female, all young female crew, which is very different from what crews normally look like for these celebrities when they go be interviewed. Usually it's, very male, very white. And that's kind of how it's been for a really long time. So we could see the attitude shift in the room when they walked in and saw who we were. And I think secondly, because of that atmosphere, and it was a room of young female filmmakers who really were looking for advice and had questions like that were personal to us. And we were hoping to hear their stories and get their advice. And I think that atmosphere in general created this very intimate, honest space where they could really think about the course of their lives and how it played out. And I would say the surprising thing was the celebrities weren't necessarily as closed off. The business leaders, the women who were in high positions that were still CEOs, et cetera, they were the ones that I think had to be a little more careful what they said because they were still in those positions. But the celebrities were a nice surprise.
Wow. Really interesting to hear the reaction of those ladies to you and when you walked into the room. I imagine it was really intimidating as well and nerve-wracking to meet some of these women, particularly the first ones. So did that change over time? Did it get easier?
Yes, it did get a lot easier. And I would say the only reason it got easier is because we had to do so many of them. So, me personally, I'm a very introverted person. And when I was in college, I went to journalism school, and that really just kicked my butt in terms of making me go out into the world and meet strangers and ask them to be open and honest with me in interviews. And so that's something that I've learned over the course of my career, but especially with this one. I think the very first interview was with Mary Barra, the CEO of GM. And I remember for weeks being nervous about this interview and agonizing over it and looking over the questions and thinking through all of the possible scenarios that could go wrong. But after the Mary Barra interview, things really ramped up. And we sometimes would have 2-3 shoots a week where we were flying across the country and not having a lot of time to prepare or, staying up late preparing, but really not having a lot of time to think about how nervous we could be. And so I think by the time we got to someone like Oprah, it was a lot easier to just walk in and just kind of have the experience of the others behind us as backup for confidence, but also knowing that it was going to be okay and knowing how those environments were, how receptive they were to us. So, yeah.
I can't imagine it being easy to meet Oprah. I mean, easy in the sense she would be warm and all of that, but yeah, I would probably faint. But yeah, and it also sounds like, just such a momentous project to have met all of these women. So since then, are there other projects you've worked on that have had, such an impact on you? Does this really just top it off for you?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I love most about my career is that I've been able to cover so many topics. I don't necessarily have a specific beat. So I've been exposed to so much more than I was exposed to when I was growing up. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina in the American South. And yeah, I think just being in this space where I can meet so many different people with different life experiences is incredible. I think within the first 6 months after First came out, Diane and I were both involved in another project that had a lot of impact and reach about, it was called The Silence Breakers. It was Times Person of the Year for 2017, I believe. I might have that wrong. It's either 2017 or 2018. But that project gave both celebrity and regular women the chance to talk about their experiences with sexual harassment and assault, which was I'm so grateful I had the opportunity to work on that project. But I worked on other things from post-traumatic stress disorder, projects about that, to frontline healthcare workers, especially during the pandemic. And I just finished a project about the eviction crisis for Black women in the US. So I think each one of those stories has given me personal knowledge and life experience in addition to career experience that I'm really grateful for.
Oh, great. That last project you mentioned you just finished sounds very interesting as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a moment though to send our greetings to some of our viewers. I know we have today with us Unión Afirmativa, Empodérame, and other groups who work on defending gender equality and LGBTQ rights. And Spencer, since when Ellen came out in 1997, there obviously were consequences, as she mentions in the film that you did about that moment of coming out, on TV. And her show was canceled in 1998, and it was hard for her to get work until she was able to take part in playing the Dory character in Finding Nemo. So one of the questions that we received was, in your line of work, do you believe that discrimination against members of the LGBTQ community has diminished over time, or is it still an issue?
Yeah, and I'd like to just start by acknowledging that I'm not personally a member of the LGBTQI community, so I don't wish to speak with the sure knowledge that I would have if I were. But I will say in the years since Ellen came out on national television, there certainly has been a perspective shift in the US, specifically in the wider cultural sphere of what is accepted. And, it really helped reduce stigmas that have had a grip on society for such a long time. And Ellen, that moment for her and the subsequent work that she did, did wonders to help jumpstart that change. Just by, obviously with other activist work as well, but by being present and being visible for millions of average Americans did wonders to help create that change. But I will say that practically, and when it comes to US law, that change comes much slower. I have a couple of examples that might be helpful to kind of get that perspective. So it was 5 years after Ellen came out before the US decriminalized same-sex conduct. It was 6 years before the first same-sex marriage in the US, 11 years before the military ended their don't ask, don't tell policy, 17 years before the US Supreme Court allowed same-sex marriage nationwide. And then this year, which is 23 years after Ellen first came out, Pete Buttigieg is the first LGBTQI cabinet secretary for a sitting US president. So, and certainly like ideological shifts and change of government can sometimes pull it back in some of those advancements that we've had. And we've seen that over the past 5 or 6 years. But the hope is that the larger views of society continue to march forward. So it's harder and harder for those things to get pulled back. And obviously, certainly on personal levels with, interactions with other people who might have different, religious or ideological views, that can still happen today for a lot of people, which is harder to prevent. But like I said, I think the hope is the larger shift forward continues happening for the benefit of everyone.
I couldn't agree more. And yeah, you mentioned a lot of the progress that's been made since then. But it really goes to show the power of things like TV, to bring some of that progress forward. Because I still remember that show when she did that episode, it came out and how much it was talked about, at the time. And it was wonderful. It was momentous, but also funny. She did it in such a great way. Yeah. So one of the questions that come in so far is, could you let us know in your work as a journalist, what are the complexities of working with celebrities? Which I think is a great question, given the different projects you've done.
Absolutely. So some are really practical, like, so for instance, I have one coming up that actually in the scheduling of this talk, I wasn't sure if I was able to do it because schedules are so different for everyone because they have, hair, makeup, photographer, me, the studios, equipment, all that stuff. Usually those shoots and those productions are just more schedules to wrangle and making sure that there's time to get what we need. And certainly for celebrity shoots, time tends to use as much as possible. So they usually have a photo shoot, a video shoot. We take B-roll while they're getting their photos done, which is actually what we did for the first series. So it is a bigger schedule wrangle. And sometimes there are things that we have to, that their publicist has told us ahead of time that we cannot ask. Of course, we're a news organization. We tread that line carefully because we are allowed to ask what we need to. But because they are busy and it's, we don't often get a 2-hour long interview with a celebrity, we really have to pinpoint what we want and need from this short period of time that we have with them, which was certainly the case with firsts as well. Because sometimes we had 15 minutes and sometimes we had an hour. So,
that's quite a difference that you really have to prepare then, I imagine, for both a really short amount of time and a really long amount of time. Yeah, so requires a lot of preparation. And people actually are interested in hearing about, what that pressure of, having to interview them quickly, requirements that they have. You mentioned, some of them might, the questions, were there any other sort of special requirements? You don't have to say who asked for what, but were there other sort of special conditions or requirements that people put on this process?
I think it's different. So outside of first, there's been a few different things. They want to see what they look like in the B-roll before it's published. For Ellen specifically, we actually shot on her stage. And this was an interesting experience because her camera operators normally for the show, which this experience was a little tricky to navigate because we were a small crew of women and it was all of her male crew members that came and tried to move our cameras around, which that's a whole other topic of, whether or not we're respected in the space that we enter. But because we were in her space, I think we had a lot less control over what we wanted the shots to look like. And I think if you see in the video, the shots are both kind of far away. That was because we could only move into certain spots on her stage. So we had to work with that in the edit as well. But I think it really is kind of, their whole life is out in front of the public eye and they have very little control sometimes over what is seen of them. And I think in those spaces where we come in and ask for things, they do, I mean, which I think I would too, try to control what they can, knowing that they chose a life of celebrity. So, yeah.
Well, people actually are interested in some of the other projects that you mentioned that you've worked on. Would it be possible to comment maybe on a little bit more on the one that you just completed?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one that came to us from a freelancer who lives and works in New Orleans. And the piece was specifically about two mothers in New Orleans who have been navigating job loss because of COVID, but also subsequently eviction, basically. And all that is tied to that issue, which is, if they are able to find a landlord that accepts their vouchers for, say, Section 8 housing, because they're not getting the regular income, they need assistance for rent, usually would go to Section 8, but New Orleans, has very few Section 8 housing options. So this photojournalist, Kathleen Flynn, followed these two women for 6 months to kind of see the ups and downs of what it takes when you are living on the edge between, I would categorize both of these women as middle class before the pandemic and because of the pandemic going into poverty, and how treacherous that line is and how quickly it can swing the wrong way. And I think there is a housing crisis across the US regardless. New Orleans especially is pretty bad because of the lack of affordable housing. So
that definitely sounds very contemporary and timely. Yes. When will that come out?
That actually came out a couple of weeks ago. It is, the title of the piece is called Notice of Eviction, but it's on time.com. And I think if you Google, it was actually part of a special issue that Time did about the effects of the pandemic on women. But I can't remember the exact title because it's one of those, news titles. It's a little bit longer, but if you type in Time magazine effect of women on the pandemic eviction, it'll probably come up. But I highly recommend it. It's Kathleen did an amazing job, and so my role was that I edited her footage. So
that's definitely going on my to-watch list. So thanks for that. Let's look at some of the questions that come in the chat. There's one here that says, as an expert for the American Film Showcase program of the University of Southern California in alliance with the State Department, you've had the chance to work on interesting programs with other countries. Is there any you can comment where you learned something interesting about that culture?
That's a great question. So before the pandemic, I was actually 3 days before going to Morocco for AFS. I think what's been most interesting for me is learning about the different film communities. So not last year, 2019, I think, I traveled to both Indonesia and Israel. And I just really enjoyed meeting the different film students and kind of seeing how their cultures and their societies work with film and work within that structure and kind of what they're learning and how. With Indonesia specifically, obviously it's a very beautiful country and a lot of people come to visit, but there are opportunities for students to get into the film industry in their hometowns and areas. And instead of people flying in and filming from, say, Hollywood, they can learn and contribute in their own country as well, which I think is really important. So yeah, I think that's been a really interesting perspective for me, especially since I didn't come from the film school world. I came from journalism. It's been really interesting to learn how that's different in other countries as well.
Yeah, well, journalism definitely make it, feel even more like a career, an exciting career for people to check out. We have another question. This one is from our Binational Center, Sevam and Merida. They ask, what is the real Ellen, the affable one or the tough one? This referring to the critiques that her show has received. So I guess kind of goes back to you saying she was more serious in the interview than, her on-air personality.
That's a good question. And I think obviously I think she was also one of the shorter interviews. I might have had 20 minutes with her. Obviously I don't have enough time to see that. But I would say that just like anyone, we can encompass both of those things. And it's fair to allow her to. I mean, not excusing whatever is going on with that. I have no knowledge of it whatsoever. But I think it's so tough when you are when you are portrayed, and also you portray yourself as this certain personality for, however long she's been on the air, it's tough then when that's met with the reality that what's around her is not the same. And I hope that works out okay for her and her show, for sure.
Yeah, and I can imagine too the difference between somebody like Ellen doing a daily show, runs like Monday through Friday, right, and having to be on that often, and have that persona, as opposed to doing a movie every
right.
Once a year or twice a year, right? Okay, and another question we just got: comment on comedians in the U.S. and how important they are for the American culture.
That's a great question. I feel like they're just good barometers for what's happening. And I think oftentimes, maybe it doesn't live and what's the word I'm looking for? Like looking back on comedy from maybe 20 or 30 years ago today would not be okay or PC. But it's an interesting, I think they really are a historical stamp as society moves forward and what's accepted and what's not. And obviously they're important for American culture. And, just, I think of shows like the news comedy shows that really take a look at the presidencies and take jabs at them as well. It's like in the sense, like news, they hold accountable what's being done, whether or not it is, with reported means or just commentary. I think they're just a really interesting stamp on history, for sure. Mm-hmm. In a funny way.
I would agree. And it's been interesting to watch kind of its evolution, even in American culture. I mean, comedy's always been an important part of our culture and entertainment. But I feel like in the last, few decades at all, it has become more even almost part of our politics, as you mentioned, critiquing different administrations, but even the fact that how even presidents have come to sort of embrace the comedy culture and entertainment industry too. I think it was President Clinton who first started, one of the first to go on a nighttime show, like the Tonight Show and other shows like that. And then we had the Daily Show, which now for some people, some comedy shows have become where they get their news from, right? Their information. John Oliver, right, is a great example of that as well. Focusing on specific topics and news in a funny way. So it really, it does have a big and continues to have a big impact, I think, on American culture, comedy, and will continue to evolve, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
It seems that Marsha got frozen for a little bit. So I'm going to come in and help out a little. So Spencer, Marsha, are you back?
I am. Looks like, yeah, I had a short connection.
I was going to mention how Ellen is so important in Twitter and social media, and she did this amazing selfie. So I'm going to go out so you can come in.
Sure, yeah. So I was starting to say, sorry, I got lost there for a second. We're running, we're almost towards the end anyway, but I guess for a final question, since, we do continue to have, people who join us, who are interested in this type of work and may have missed other shows in the past or one of the last ones you did. Do you have any advice for, young women that want to start doing this kind of work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at least speaking from my personal experience, there will always be barriers to getting into this industry. I will say in what I do in video journalism kind of / documentary world, there is a lot of women. And I think that certainly has improved over the last few years. But one thing that's always served me really well and has helped me get further is taking on things that I just think I am not ready for. And that's, I think, something that all women face and fear. And, we've seen that men sometimes tend to put themselves forward for jobs that they're not qualified for. But I think for me, it really was pushing past this sense that I didn't have what it took to do something like first scared me. I think I was maybe a month into the job at time when they asked me to start doing this. And I was capable of doing it. I just hadn't been pushed in that way yet. So I think my barometer for whether or not I'm doing something that is going to benefit me is whether or not it scares me. And I've gotten comfortable with being scared and pushing myself further, and just kind of seeing how far I can go and what I could do. It is really scary at first. There's been many times I've just sat in the car, like talking myself up, like to get out and go start doing this story. But I think it's good and necessary fear to improve and keep pushing yourself, for sure.
Yeah, that is really excellent advice. If you're never scared, then you're not challenging yourself. So yeah, thank you for that. Just one comment that somebody made I'd like to share is that this year's Oscar, for the first time, we have 2 women nominated as directors, which is amazing. And hopefully, in the years to come won't be a big deal anymore because we'll have more women directors being nominated.
I actually have a little push. So one of my friends was nominated for Best Short Documentary, and she is a woman of color director. Her film, A Love Song for Latasha, is on Netflix. That's one of the nominated films. So her name is Sophia Allison. Yeah.
Thanks for that plug. Yeah, no,
yeah.
good to know. All right, so we're at the end of our show, and we just want to invite you back this time in 2 weeks rather than 3 weeks, because next week is Easter week, which is widely celebrated around Latin America. But then we'll be back on April 13th, where we'll be featuring Rita Moreno. So Spencer, thank you again so much for accepting our invitation. As always, a pleasure to have you to meet our Venezuelan audience. Any final thoughts or comments?
No, I just am always so thrilled to talk about this project, and it has been really fun. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
And thank you again, as always, to Isabela Las Mercedes for hosting us. You've been wonderful, as always. Thank you also to the NGOs that accompanied us today, journalists, binational center students, and our general audience. So we hope to see you back again in 3 weeks. Please have a great rest of the afternoon. Be safe and take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.